Okay, so now we are going to move on a little bit to how you can also take an input from a user and store that input as a string. So we've talked a little bit about functions. So what are some functions that we've seen before? Again, dir is an example of it. Type is an example of a function. Print is an example of a function. These are built-in functions that take in arguments, and the way you call them is you have to use the open and close parentheses. So input is very useful. And what input does is it takes in input from a user. So right now we're in the interpreter, but when you run something like a script, this will be a lot more useful. So let's say you wanted the user of a script to enter a number. And so what you can do is you can use the input function. This will print out a line that will help the user know what they're supposed to put in. And then you need to designate where you want the user input to be stored. So let's see what happens. Okay, enter a number. So we've done that, 23,432. And so we see X has been stored as 23,432. What kind of object is this? This is a string object. You can tell because there's the single quotes around it. We could also confirm that using the type function. So let us now try this using a script. And we will modify our first script. And we will say something like this. And we'll also add this colon and this space in order to make it a little bit more more friendly to see what exactly we need. And then we'll just simply print the value of X. Okay, so we've modified this file. And again, to run a script, you type Python 3, and then you put the name of the script in. And we're just using tab to automatically complete that. Please enter a number, 54, and we now print it out. All right, let's say we wanted to take in two different numbers. Y equals, please enter a second number. And now let's do this. All right, so now we've taken in two different numbers and we've stored them as X and Y respectively. And again, these are strings. The automatic way to do it is to take them in as strings. All right, so let's say we wanted to have a script that adds 3 to whatever number you want. So let's give a little information before we ask for the input from a user. So we're going to use the print function. So now we can see where the print function becomes a little bit more useful. This script adds 3 to any number you give it. So maybe we can do something like this and then add 3 to it. Or actually, let's just do it like this instead. So to kind of explore some of the other things we did, we'll do something like this. So this is the assignment operator. This both adds 3 to X and then stores the result as the new number. So let's see if this works. So now we see the print statement. This script adds 3 to any number you give it. Now we can enter a number. Oh, but now we get a type error. So the type error is that you can only concatenate a string to a string and not an integer. So what is the issue? So you can also see this in the interpreter. So we've created a string object 43, and what happens when we add 3 to it. So we get a type error. You can only concatenate a string, not an integer to a string. So why do we get this error? The reason we get this error is because Python doesn't know how to combine strings and integers. So strings are text. And so right now we've stored this number as a string object because that's the default way that Python works. So if we want to treat this as a number, we have to change the value into an integer object. And so this is where, again, explicitly creating objects comes into play. So we saw before, you can implicitly create an integer by doing something like this, or you can do something like this to explicitly say, I want to create an integer type class object. And so how do we do that? So one way to do that is we can do something like this. So x is currently a string, but we can also, the class constructor knows how to take a string and convert that into an integer object. So you notice that now we have lost these single quotes, and that indicates that what was created is no longer a string. And we can confirm that with the type function, and we see it's a class integer right here. So if we want to fix this code, we can do something like this. There are actually a couple different ways we can do that. So we can do this, where we take in the input, we convert it to an integer, we add 3, and then we print it. Similarly, we'll do that to the second number. And now we run the script. So 23, 26 is printed out, 43, 46 is printed out. So that's one way to fix it. There's actually a number of ways you can fix it. You could also, for example, combine the two function calls into a single line. And so let's see if this works as well. So kind of the way you become a good coder is you just try stuff and see if it works. And lo and behold, we see that it actually works. So what have we done here? So you can see that we've said take the input of this, please enter a number. So whatever the user stores is used as the argument for the int function. And so this is a string object that is sent to the int function, and then x is stored as whatever the output is of this. So one thing, we haven't really explicitly said it, I haven't really explicitly said it, but one of the things that's really important about functions is functions also return things. They return objects. So what do I mean by that? So input, for example, runs, and what are all the things that it does? So one of the things it does is it prints this to the screen, and then it opens the console to allow you to enter information into it, and then it takes that, whatever you've entered in it, it creates a string object, and then it returns that to do whatever we want to do with it. So one thing we can do is add it to the assignment operator. So the assignment operator says, okay, take this object and store it as x. And then we also saw how you can use it as an argument to a function by doing something like this. The int also returns an object, an integer object, that you can also use to store, for example. You can also do the opposite. So let's say you wanted to take an integer. So let's go back into the interpreter. Let's say you had an integer. Again, we see that it's an integer. It doesn't show the decimal place. There's no single quotes. We can confirm that using the type function. And then let's say we wanted to convert it to a string. And so this is where explicitly declaring it as a string by using the class name also works. And so now you see what is returned as that. And so the string function returns a string object, which we can store, for example, as y, and then we can confirm that it's actually a string. So we have, let's recreate the phrase. All right, so we have this phrase. So one of the things that you should do when you're encountering new objects that you haven't used before, so you should always look into what are the methods and attributes of it. So this is where the dir function, for example, is very useful because it lists all of the different functions that you can use, and all of the different methods and attributes that you can use. And for a string object, there's actually a lot of useful there's a lot more useful methods that you are going to use than what we encountered in the integer and those other numerical classes. So let's see some examples of these. So phrase, and then there is a method called title. We don't know yet if it's an attribute or a method, so you can always try. Okay, we get this error built-in method, and so it's always fun. It's fun to read Watership down. So what does this method do? It actually, you can see it capitalizes certain letters. So it capitalizes the first letter of every word, and here it looks like it gets a little bit confused about what the S is, and it also capitalizes the apostrophe S. Upper, what does upper do? So you can see it converts all of the letters from lowercase to uppercase. There's also a similar function called lower, and you see that it converts all of the letters to the lowercase. So these are starting to get useful. You know, there are certain situations where you might want to have the uppercase or lowercase of all the letters within a string. And notice we haven't changed the value of phrase, so phrase is still the same. It's still the same original object. What these methods are doing is they're returning brand new objects that you could, for example, store as a different variable. And so once we store this as a new variable, it no longer prints it out to the screen. Instead, it just stores it within this variable called new phrase. All right, so pretty straightforward. So you'll also notice that, for example, string has something called add. And so what happens if you try to add two strings together? So I've created two strings. So first name, last name. So you can see that there are two different strings by the fact that there's single quotes within there. And what happens if I try to add these together? So before I got an error when I tried to add a string to an integer together, because that confuses Python. It doesn't know what exactly you mean when you try to do something like that. But if you add two strings together, it knows what to do. And this is basically concatenating the two strings together. So it takes first name and last name and concatenates those together, and then it returns it as a brand new object. So again, we could store it if we wanted to, and now we have the new combined name, and the original ones are the same. This is actually the same as doing something like this. So we can also, instead of using the operator, the mathematical operator, so this and this, these two lines are the same. In the first case, we use the mathematical operator, and then in the second case, we use this magic method called add. And this, once you get underneath the hood of Python, of how it works, this is how Python works. So the way it's able to add two things together is it relies upon this method called add. And so many different classes will all have their own version of the add method. And so if the object has the method, then you're able to use this mathematical operation. You'll notice though that so for example, let's say we have an integer x equals 16. So you'll notice that x has, for example, an add method, and then it also has a subtract magic method, which is given by this right here. It also has a magic method for multiplication, which is given right here, and it also has a magic method for divide. So I guess there is divide mod, and then now I forget what exactly the divide one is. Let's see if I can figure it out on the fly. So I believe it probably relies on this as the magic method. So it both divides and then also provides the remainder at the same time. And let's see what true divide does. I guess that's what you use if you want to actually create a float. So 16 divided by 3 is 5.333. If we look at first name, so this is a string, and then if we look at the functions, if we look at the methods and attributes that are associated with the string object, so we saw that there was this add magic method, but there is no subtract, multiply, there is no subtract or divide magic method, but you notice there is a multiply magic method. So let's see how some of these things work. So if I try to take first name and I subtract the last name from it, we get an error, unsupported operating types for minus string and string. So Python doesn't know how to implement the minus operation for different strings. Let's say we try to multiply. And so you'll notice that one of the things you can do with strings is you can multiply it. And so all this does is it takes whatever the strings is and repeats it however many times you specify right here. But what is not implemented is the ability to multiply two strings together. So you can only use this multiplication by giving it a string. And so again, we can use the magic method in order to do that. And if we give it, for example, a string, we see that we get the exact same thing. So that hopefully is mostly straightforward, kind of how that process whole works. But again, one of the key takeaways of this lecture is you should always use the dir function, and then you should feel comfortable with starting to try to use, just try out, the different methods. So we'll go over some more of the methods in the later part of the lecture, and you're going to learn how to use them, and you'll start to feel comfortable with them. But in another month, you're going to forget all of the details. And so by using this dir function, you can look to see and then remind yourself, oh yeah, that's what it was called. It was called find, or that's what it was called. It was called count. Whatever the exact method that you're trying to do.